I'll jump into a little bit about the Seder, because I think some of us are also focused on the Seder. In case you forgot, I almost forgot it is on Tuesday. Oh, it's on Monday. See what happens? The good news is I have hot water, so I will be smelling fresh and clean. In any case, there's some strange rituals that I wanted to point out at the Seder. When we open the door for Elijah, and we pour a cup of wine, and we invite Elijah to do what? We invite him to drink it. I always like to surreptitiously, like knock into the table. Look, he's drinking it. It's very, I don't know, it feels a little like the Christian custom of Santa Claus. Did he eat the cookies and drink the milk? Another one that's a little bit weird are the songs. Does anyone sing songs about the plagues? Anyone ever hear a song about the plague? No one. No one. Just a few of you. Frogs? Frog songs? One morning when Pharaoh awoke in his bed, there were frogs, and frogs on his head, frogs on his toes, frogs here, frogs there, frogs where. I've always wanted to do that. So thank you so much for allowing me this special moment. Well, of course, the song is to engage the children, but actually it engages the adults, as we just saw. If you step back and look at it from 30,000 feet, it's actually really bizarre. We're singing a song about a plague of frogs that has descended upon Egypt. We once bought this little pack of plagues, the pack of plagues. And it had some cool stuff. It had a ping pong ball for hell. I don't know if, John, if you want this little souvenir. Yeah. It had sunglasses for the plague of darkness. Always wanted to give a sermon like this. So they're not certified. Do not watch the eclipse. But I want to get serious, given the events of this past week. The darkness of these sunglasses makes me think of the darkness last Saturday night. Israelis and those visiting Israel like Meir, many of our family, as I look around the room, many of our friends, were suddenly told that drones, missiles, and ICBMs, in case you don't know, I looked them up, intercontinental ballistic missiles, were heading to their country. This was not a regular attack. It's like almost ridiculous. This was not a regular attack that they have all the time with missiles coming from Gaza and Lebanon. It's like a normal day. This was some serious firepower, and it wasn't from any proxy like Hamas or Hezbollah or the Houthis or Syrian or Iraqi fighters aligned with Iran. This was Iran itself, straight up. It was a pretty big deal and a pretty bad one. These 320 rockets and drones were aimed all over Israel and would have caused untold damage. But they didn't. Again, just like a community comes together, this was a community of nations that came together. Obviously, first and foremost, the United States of America, United Kingdom, France, and even Arab nations. I mean, we should pause and think about that. The United Arab Emirates, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan were all involved in protecting Israel from this attack. And miraculously, all these missiles did almost no damage. Tragically, for one Arab Muslim Israeli citizen girl, she was seriously wounded, and we we hold her in our heart and pray for refuah shlema, for healing. One Israeli physics professor wrote, this professor worked in the defense industry, and he said, for all the things to happen in Israel last Saturday night, he said it was on par with the miracle of the splitting of the sea. The likelihood, he apparently took out a paper and pencil and wrote it down. I have no idea how he computes such a thing. The likelihood of all of the things working out in such a complicated system that had never been tested in real time before was incredibly low. He wrote, what happened is that every single person, but everyone, the pilots, the system operators, and the technology operators acted as one, at one moment in total unity. And they had to deal with each of these missiles individually. The professor then went on to attribute this to God. Now, as many of you know, I'm not a big believer in God working supernatural miracles, but I do see that God can motivate human beings to do great things, to act to our fullest potential, to truly do miracles, especially when we live out God's values, as all of these people and all of these countries, just like our community, can rally whenever we need to. I see it like a beautiful dance in my theology. God's inspiration, God's spiritual presence mixing with human actors. Think about the inspiration that gave Moses the strength to leave Egypt. The strength for Nadav to walk into the Sea of Reeds with the water up to his nostrils. To give Miriam the joy when the people were finally saved from the Egyptian army. God and people becoming one 3,500 years ago in Egypt and 1 week ago in Israel. Now, this is Shabbat HaGadol, the great Shabbat, and we just heard the Haftarah that Rabbi Kling-Perkins introduced. It was given by the prophet Malachi, who lived 2,550 years ago in a time of trauma. He lived after the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem, and all of these events, including the beginning of the exile in Babylonia. He writes in this beautiful line that the generations will come together. I don't know if you said this, but maybe not. You avoided it for me. There you go. He talks about how all the generations will somehow turn to one another and be reconciled to one another. And I think that this is a moment that may be very challenging this year for some of us. I've spoken to a lot of people, especially some grandparents, parents who've spoken about their children just being in a very different place during this Gaza-Israel war. And I think many of the disagreements fall on generational lines, although not exclusively. So I hope, first of all, as Malachi invites us to, that we find some common ground and at least respectful conversation in a common space at the Seder. I want to focus on one line from the Haftarah, one of my favorite lines. Hinei anochi noten lachem et Eliah hanavi, lifnei bo Yom HaGadol, Yom Adonai HaGadol Lanora. As Susan chanted it twice because it's so important, I will send to you Elijah the prophet before the coming of this great and awesome day of God. And so Malachi chooses Elijah, Eliyahu, who lived 300 years earlier, to be the harbinger of redemption, to be the one who would usher in a time of peace for the entire world. Now, it's a strange choice because Elijah is multifaceted, but maybe one of his biggest moments is his battle with the Baal, pagan priests. What happens at the end of this battle? He does flee, but at the end of the battle, he wins. in a pretty bloody way, let's just say. From that story, as he kills the 500 priests of Baal, he doesn't seem like an agent of peace. He has a kind of dangerous zealousness that's not at all peaceful. While we might see that inclination, it's a reminder to stay far away from that desire. And immediately after, as Lou said, we find Elijah runs away into the wilderness, and one of the most beautiful moments happens on the top of a mountain. It's his own private Sinai-like moment. He says there was a great and mighty wind, a splitting of mountains and a shattering of rocks by God's power, but God's not in the wind. After the wind, an earthquake, but God was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, fire, but God's not in the fire. And after the fire, a soft, murmuring voice. The cold mamadaka, the small, still voice. I like the way Paul Simon wrote about it. The sound of silence. Elijah is a person of action, but he also has this side of contemplation. A mystical prophet who heals. He heals a boy who's right upon death or maybe has died. He's a man who dies and ascends to heaven on a divine chariot in a whirlwind. And Elijah becomes a symbol for the protection of the Jewish people. Quiet protection. We call upon us to support us in any difficult moment and to protect us. Think about when a baby boy enters the covenant. There's Elijah. On Saturday nights, as we prepare for the work week, we call upon Elijah to sustain us. But I think his most dramatic moment happens at the Seder, right after we eat dinner. What do? We open the door and invite Elijah in. We ask him to protect us from our enemies. And apparently for a lot of Jewish history, for thousands of years, Jews had no way to protect themselves. Passover was often a time where Jews were violently attacked, where they were accused falsely of killing Christian children and even drinking their blood as our wine at the Seder, the blood libels. And since Jews had no one to actually call for help, they called upon Elijah. Maybe he can help us now, as he's done for thousands of years. If I think about my own Seder and my experience in my life, maybe yours has been similar. I've never experienced any fear at a Seder. In fact, for most of my life here in America, I never really feared for much as a Jew. I can always walk around with my kippah anywhere and be proud. Our Seders are a time where we come together, where we eat and rejoice and tell the story of the Exodus. A time for sharing. But this year, I think it feels a little bit different. How do we celebrate when we know our sisters and brothers are vulnerable in a way that has not happened since the birth of the state of Israel? Maybe actually since the Shoah, since the Holocaust. Our Israeli brethren are truly threatened by Iran and its proxies who surround them. How do we celebrate this year when we know that 130 of us are still hostages? Or in other words, are still in Egypt. The Hebrew word for Egypt is Mitzrayim. The rabbis say Makom Tsar, a narrow place. And our people are right now being held in a narrow underground place, held by one of the most violent terrorist groups our world has ever known. How can you also celebrate and eat so much when you know that so many in Gaza are hungry? There is such a disconnect between the holiday this year and the reality in which we are living. Like the Seder, I have many questions, but I don't have the answers. What should Israel do? Was its response on Thursday night the right move? How can it still eliminate Hamas and get back negotiate the return of the hostages, which in my mind should be the priority. Maybe it should simply stop and figure out how to get them home. How can it help the Gazans without endangering its own soldiers and its own security? 3 moments in the Seder resonant for me deeply this year. One right at the beginning. What do we do with the middle matzah? We break it in half. And we focus on the brokenness of the world. There is brokenness all around. It is a shattered world, full of challenges, full of moments that are unexpectedly difficult. We enter the Seder with the story of our redemption, with an awareness that things are broken, and it's always true. Another moment is when we eat the karpas. When we eat the karpas, that green vegetable, there's a different feeling. It's a connection to springtime. It's a connection to hope. One of the names of Pesach, Chag Aviv, the holiday of springtime, which reminds us that there is renewal even without human agency. Right? Things are growing. We didn't do anything. The world renews itself. It reminds us that goodness can be just around the corner. And then for me, there's the third statement, the third powerful piece of the Haggadah, maybe the central thesis. B'chol dor vador, chayav adam lirod et atzmo, kilu hu yatsa miMitzrayim. In every generation, you need to see yourself as if you went out of Egypt, because Adonai acted for me. Of course, this is strange. I'm living 3,500 years later. But the Haggadah is saying it's also now. It's as if we came out of Egypt. It's as if we suffered. We identify with the suffering, and we think about how transformative it is to help someone, to help those in need, to reach out in a hard moment, to reach out in a time of war. The story of the Exodus is not merely an ancient one, but it's one that we're actually living right now. Let my people go is as true today as it was then. I grew up with the custom of passing around a mirror to every participant in the Seder so that you can look at yourself as if you left Egypt. I still follow my parents' custom, and it invites me to reflect for a second. Also reminds me my tie is actually not straight, but in any case, it invites me to think about where is that still small voice that inspires us in a way that can move us toward a more modern Exodus, a moral world that is closer to the biblical idea of redemption. When we call upon Elijah this year, let it be a call, even a cry out to help Israel from the modern hail of rockets and bring the spiritual energy, that spiritual presence that helps us become aware not only of the complexity of this world, but helps us see ourselves in our redemption and in the narrative of redemption, both ancient and right now. Shabbat Shalom and Chag Kasher v'Sameach, a kosher and happy Pesach to everyone.